So most discussions of religion and spiritual practices center on dogmas and beliefs, either of a particular religion or a comparison across faiths. I, however, would like to look at religions and spiritual practices that are an integral part of every religion from the perspective of what I am, which is a consciousness experimentalist. And I want to set aside all the dogmas and beliefs and sectarianism and all of that and look at the sort of fundamentals. Because when I look at a religion, any religion, as an experimentalist, what I see is a cohort of people consensually holding a worldview. The process by which that worldview emerges seems to me very much like Thomas Kuhn's description of the paradigm process. The paradigm in religion is defined by scripture and dogma, not research and theory. And unlike science, there is not one religious paradigm, but superficially several. The paradigms differ in many ways at a superficial level, but they all have one thing in common. All of them are centered on the aspect of consciousness that in science we call the non-local. And that is now being explicitly researched in several disciplines using a variety of protocols such as near-death studies, therapeutic intention work, and remote viewing. In religion, the individual experience of non-local awareness is called spirit. The eternal aspect of the self is religion's soul. It is a concept amenable, I think, to objective verification. We see one aspect in the near-death studies, and thanks to the research at the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia School of Medicine, we also know something about continuity of consciousness because of the extraordinary decades-long project led by two generations of physicians, Ian Stevenson, and when he retired in 2002, then Jim Tucker. They have been studying reincarnation in the most methodical and rigorous manner, and their research really has something important to say. The data from this research, like data on NDEs, presents a compelling, objectively measured case for the continuity of consciousness. And while I am on it, I think it's notable that although consciousness is often conceived of in physics terms, some of the most important insights about consciousness have come from medicine. The research on NDEs, therapeutic intention, reincarnation are all examples of that. As a researcher, enduring religions seem to me examples of empirical science, and that's really the way that I look at them. I use the term enduring religions to distinguish from transitory cults, because there is a difference. All of the enduring faiths over generations and millennia, if you look at their histories, developed a kind of an empirical neurobiology involving opening to non-local consciousness. There is an innate recognition of the reality of non-local consciousness in all religions. A small group of materialist scientists, another small cohort of atheists, and a few other small factions may think otherwise, but for the bulk of humanity, across time, geography, and culture, within the religious spiritual context, the reality of non-local consciousness has been foundational. And I think that's very important. Why would a religion fundamentally, whatever kind of religion it was, hold the idea that there is continuity of consciousness? Across all religions, rituals are designed to the same end, to train a person to attain and sustain intention-focused awareness. The mechanism to do this is grounded in the rituals, the religious equivalent, in my view, of scientific protocols. That's why cultures like the martial arts of Japan, Buddhist temples, and Christian monasteries are all based on a lifestyle of attaining and sustaining intention-focused awareness, even though it is expressed in many different ways and is placed in different contexts. But the basic idea is that through meditation particularly, religions teach us how to open to non-local consciousness. In consciousness research, we confirm the wisdom of that religious anthropology. We know from the experimental data that meditators routinely do better at non-local tasks than non-meditators, whether it is remote viewing, expressing therapeutic intention, or any other non-local task. And why is that? And I think the answer is because meditators can attain and sustain intention-focused awareness better than random people who lack this training. And intention-focused awareness is how one opens to the non-local, whether it is in a religious or a scientific context. What differs is not the process of the experience, but the assessment we make of the experience through the culture of our worldview. In science, we assess non-local consciousness not through faith, but in objectively verifiable ways. We have protocols and measurements and a shared worldview that facts matter. In religion, the measurement is orthodoxy and adherence to dogmas and beliefs. Facts hardly enter into it. But whether it is science or religion, experiencing non-local consciousness is the fundamental experience. Non-local consciousness experience is our faith's birth cradle. Regardless of denomination, dogma, or belief, all religions begin with a single individual who experiences a non-local consciousness event. Almost nobody ever talks about this, but it strikes me as very significant. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, whose birth is dated between 578 and 447 BCE, awakens in the hermitage of Arata Kalama, a teacher of meditation who shows him how, through meditation, he can attain, this is a quote, a state of non-existence. And he does experience this state of intention-focused awareness. And there are several versions of his awakening. I will use the description of the scholar monk Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Daniel DeGraff, an American Buddhist monk of the Thai forest tradition, whose books and videos have had a major impact on the modern understanding of Buddhism. He writes, this is a quote, the Buddha described the awakening experience in one of his discourses. First, there is the knowledge of the regularity of the Dhamma, which in this context means dependent co-arising. Then there is the knowledge of the Nibbana. I apologize, by the way, for my mispronunciation. I know I'm butchering a lot of these words' pronunciation. In other passages, he describes the three stages that led to the insight into dependent co-arising: knowledge of his own previous lifetimes, knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of all living beings, and finally, insight into what he called the Four Noble Truths. The first two forms of knowledge were not new with the Buddha. They've been reported on by other seers throughout history, although the Buddha's insight into the second knowledge had a special twist. He saw that beings are reborn according to the ethical quality of their thoughts, words, and deeds, and this quality is essentially a factor of the mind. Now, when you look at the Stevenson Tucker, Erlander Harrelson, reincarnation work, particularly the two-volume book that Ian wrote about biology and reincarnation, when he shows that scar tissues in a new life were where a wound that brought an end to life in a previous life occur, that sort of thing, or where individuals are marked as they are dying, and then in a new life, the child has that same mark. These kinds of things, the quality of one's views and intentions determine the experience result of one's actions. Jesus, at the beginning of the Common Era, at the age of 30, experiences his opening of consciousness when he's baptized and goes to meditate in the wilderness. In 610 CE, at 40, Muhammad experiences a revelation in a cave called Hira, where he had gone to meditate. And the archangel Gabriel appeared to him and told him he would be a messenger of God. It should be noted, I think, that in all of these accounts, so different in their details, that the one constant that you see in all of them is meditation, the practice of attaining and sustaining intention-focused awareness, exactly what is required in the scientific exploration of non-local consciousness in protocols like remote viewing. Those individual revelations only become the basis of religion, however, if they are recognized by others. Revelation is an individual experience, but religion is a group consensus. That is what separates cranks from prophets. The latter must have personalities charismatic enough to attract people to come and listen to them. Everything after that is the product of human thought and action. From the accounts of the teachings arise scriptures and the institutions that grow up around these teachings, manned by individuals who commit themselves to maintaining the dogma and their perception of its orthodoxy. But it all begins with one person having a non-local consciousness experience or experiences, and that person's experiences of the non-local transmitted to others who accept them and become enthralled by them becomes the path. With that foundation, it isn't really surprising that the rituals of religion all seek to give practitioners a measure of focused control over mind and body, holding out the promise that they too may be able to open to the non-local aspect of consciousness. Inevitably, the paths incorporate some model of non-local unity, promising it as the path or the way, and the rituals to attain this state of consciousness develop by empirical observation across millennia. In Christianity, the Spirit of the Lord is the creative power of life. It is an incorporeal feeling of connecting with a greater conscious unity. In the New Testament, spirit is described as that aspect of consciousness wherein a direct relationship with God is possible. It is the spiritual aspect that enables continuing conversation with the divine spirit. Totems like rosaries, prayer beads, religious statues, and structured prayers help the follower to develop intention-focused awareness, which research has shown is again the key to opening to non-local awareness. The 16th century Christian saint and Carmelite mystic, Saint Teresa of Avila counseled, and this is a quote, "This magnificent refuge is inside you. Enter. Shatter the darkness that shrouds the doorway. Be bold, be humble. Put away the incense and forget the incantations they taught you. Ask no permission from the authorities." That's very interesting, coming from a Catholic nun. "Close your eyes and follow your breath to the still place that leads to the invisible path that leads you home. Follow your breath." I mean, listen, you think about that. It's a statement from a medieval Roman Catholic that a Buddhist or a Hindu could comfortably have made, and one did. Patanjali, thought to be the author of the famous Yoga Sutras, is one of those mysterious figures from the ancient past. We have only the single name, have no idea where exactly he was born or even exactly when he lived. The best that both Eastern and Western scholars can do is say that it was somewhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE. Almost certainly born a Hindu, he apparently studied a number of spiritual traditions in his personal quest, as indicated by the fact that he wrote his famous sutras in a hybrid Buddhist-Hindu Sanskrit. It's clear that he understood spirituality as a matter of consciousness, something not restricted to any one religion, because the sutras speak at length about moving into non-local awareness through meditation. A good friend of many of us, psychologist William Broad, who made a particular study of this, noted, and this is a quote, "The 6th, 7th, and 8th limbs of Ashtanga yoga are dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi, profound absorption, respectively," end quote. Patanjali refines this further, Broad explains, saying the repeated continuation or uninterrupted stream of that one point of focus is called absorption in meditation, dhyana, and is the 7th of the 8 steps. When these 3 are practiced together, the composite process is called samayama. Samayama might be translated as constraint, thorough, complete, or perfect restraint, or full control, or complete focus. It might also be translated as communion or mind pose. Samyama conveys a sense of knowing through being and awareness, through becoming what is known. Through mastery of samyama comes insight, and through its progressive application in stages come knowledge of the self and the various principles of reality. With increasing yogic practice comes a variety of mystical, unitive experiences, states, conditions, or fulfillments, the various samadhis, along with their attainments and powers. The linkage with the non-local and the creation of a sacred space is another manifestation of consciousness threaded throughout religions, through time and across time and geography and culture. There's always a dedicated place to meet. And that's interesting in itself, whether it's a temple, a cathedral, a synagogue, or an Etruscan oak grove. Why does this place issue seem to matter so much? Is there something objectively verifiable about sacred space beyond the obvious psychological, emotional importance? The non-local consciousness research suggests that there is. It is a sacred space becomes sacred because it is more numinous. Carl Jung described numinosity thus, quote, "We should not be in the least surprised if the empirical manifestations of unconscious contacts bear all the marks of something illimitable, something not determined by space-time. This quality is numinous. Noumena are psychic entia," Jung says. Noumena are psychic entia. I think the research confirms that noumena, which I believe should be thought of as non-local information, that numinosity is a kind of non-local information architecture that can be detected by consciousness and to some degree manipulated through intention-focused awareness. The more frequently attention is focused on anything, the more it develops numinous qualities, which may be of a positive or a negative valence. The more numinous the object, the easier it becomes for others to unconsciously sense this quality. Numinous constructs excite a stronger psychophysical response than mundane objects. As such, they can be unconsciously discriminated from less numinous objects. In remote viewing research, for instance, we know that targets of greater numinosity are easier to perceive than targets that may have similar physical characteristics but are less numinous. Functionally, that means that Chartres Cathedral is easier to see than a French warehouse of the same size. Now, why is that? It's because I think Chartres Cathedral, from the moment of its conception, for all the centuries since that moment, has been the focus of unnumbered acts of intention awareness experienced in a heightened state of emotion. In contrast, nobody pays any attention to warehouses, nor do they evoke much emotion even when they are noticed. This non-local intention effect also extends to substances. We associate with substances that we associate with religious rituals like water and wine. This linkage of water, wine, and the sacred is so ancient, its origins are lost in deep time. But the question is, why should such a linkage exist? The obvious answer in the case of water is that human life is not possible without it. Perhaps that's the reason it is the primordial element in most creation myths. Examples: the Assyro-Babylonian gods that arose from the melding of salt, Tiamat, and sweet potable water, Apsu, the Egyptian sun god Om, who arose from the world ocean, Nun. The Judeo-Christian Bible begins with God dividing the waters, Genesis 1:1-6. The story of humanity is dotted with sacred rivers, springs, and lakes. It's been a fundamental belief in many religions that praying, focusing therapeutic intention on water, transforms it in some way, making it sacred. It is an idea that dates back into deep time, and yet it continues down to the present day. The Christian faiths of Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Coptic Christianity, Oriental Orthodoxy hold to this dogma, as does Anglicanism. It is a cultural aspect of water that is well recognized and widely discussed in anthropology, history, and theology, but almost never from the perspective that something objectively measurable is actually happening. But is this only a belief, an article of faith, or is it another example of an insight concerning non-local consciousness gained through close empirical observation, evolving across generations? Does anything actually change in the water that is the focus of intentioned awareness, something that can be objectively measured? Is this change physical or subjective and aesthetic, or both? It is the second aspect of sacred water that I wish to focus on here. There are a number of studies directly addressing the question, is there a physical change that can be objectively measured? The answer through replicated spectroscopy studies, including my own, using well-established protocols employed in laboratories around the world, is yes, there is a physically, objectively measurable change. Here's an example. In the study that I did through standard techniques of infrared spectrophotometry, sterile water samples in randomly selected sealed vials showed alteration of their infrared spectra compared to controls after being exposed to the palms of hands of both practicing and non-practicing therapeutic practitioners, each of whom employed a personal variation of the laying on of hands therapeutic touch rituals. This pilot study presents 14 cases involving 14 practitioners and 14 recipients. And it produced a overall yield of P equals 0.005. And I think that when you look at the representative evidence for the effect that appeared in the sample group of treated versus calibration controls, you get a P 0.0004. The second hypothesis, which is assumed, is that there exists some kind of relationship between the intensity of the effect and the time of the exposure, but this was not confirmed in my study or in the studies done by Douglas Dean, which what prompted me to do it. This study replicates earlier findings under conditions of blindness, randomicity, several levels of controls, and there are no things like temperature, biometric pressure, handling, any of those things that can explain the effect. Beginning in 1994, Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto had the idea to freeze double distilled water and freeze the snow crystals from the water and observe through a microscope the snow crystals that formed. And his idea was to see if various stimuli to which the water was exposed would change people's aesthetic experience. This is very interesting. So because what this research is telling us is not only can there be an objective change, but there can be a subjective aesthetic change, which can be measured. He showed alphabet letters to the water. He presented pictures to the water. He played music to the water. He then froze the water and had people look at the snow crystals, comparing their aesthetic experience to that of the treated water with identical water that was not a focus of such therapeutic intention. And there were differences. The pictures of the snow crystals make it obvious. If you look at them, I can't show them, but you can look at them. He also Emoto also addressed the question as to whether intention-focused awareness using the ritual of prayer caused a change, and once again, he found that it did. The water upon which intention had been focused produced crystals that were judged to be more aesthetically appealing when compared to controlled snow crystals of water that had not been the target of therapeutic intention. Dean Radin, known to all of us, chief scientist at the Institute for Noetic Sciences, took up this question because the Emoto stuff became controversial. And he created a variation of Emoto's protocol that, in my view, dealt with all the issues advanced, all the criticisms that were advanced to Emoto's work. And in 2006, Radin's team reported these results. The hypothesis, a quote, the hypothesis that water treated with intention can affect ice crystals formed from that water was pilot tested under double-blind conditions. A group of approximately 2,000 people in Tokyo focused positive intentions toward water samples located inside an electromagnetically shielded room in Petaluma. That group was unaware of similar water samples set aside in different locations which served as controls. Ice crystals formed from both sets of water samples were blindly identified and photographed by an analyst, and the resulting images were blindly assessed for aesthetic appeal by 100 different independent judges. The results indicated that crystals from the treated water were given higher scores for aesthetic appeal than those from the control water, P equals 0.001. So the oldest archaeological evidence of wine dates to 7,000 to 6,600 BCE and involves a fermented beverage comprised of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit and grape. A joint American research team led by archaeologist Patrick McGovern from the Pennsylvania Museum recovered residue in pottery vessels found in Jihar, China, in the Yellow River Valley during the excavations of a Neolithic village. This predates by about 500 years the earliest prior evidence of wine found in the Middle East. Yesterday, I talked about this. I decided to test whether though there was something in the wine that would be subjectively, aesthetically different if it was focused to intentioned awareness, because wine plays such a big role in so many religions, particularly, I mean, in the Christian, goodness, the word is long gone from my head. Christian, anyway, the religious ceremony during a Roman Catholic service or a Christian Protestant service. There is something about that has been around now for thousands of years of the priests blessing the water as the wine, and that in some way it is transformed. So I wanted to see whether that was really true and measurable. So I took wine. I buy a bottle of wine, 750 milliliter, and just standard wine you'd buy if you were going to go to somebody's house for a dinner party. And I split the wine into two 375 milliliter carafes, and I took those to three friends, and I said to them, I'm going to make a big wine buy, and I'm down to 2 wines, and could you have 7 people come over to your house and test these 2 wines and tell me which one they think is better? Then they did not know, and I didn't tell the party giver or the people that did the testing, was that I took one of the carafes to a meditation group, put it on a chair in the middle of the circle of the meditation group, and asked them to please focus good intentions on the wine. And what we discovered I did this 12 times over a series of years. And what I discovered was that the people who tasted the wines in 11 out of the 12 cases always picked the treated wines, the wines that had been focused of therapeutic intention. And this confirms the Emoto work, my earlier water work, and Radin's work. He similarly did an experiment in which he had people he took bars of chocolate and split the chocolate into 2 pieces. One was the target of intention awareness by Buddhist monks, and the other was just the controls. And he asked people to eat the chocolate, and he measured their sense of well-being. And what he discovered and reported on was that those pieces of the chocolate that were the focus of therapeutic awareness, non-local focused intention, were perceived as making people feel happier, and they felt a greater well-being. And so you can see how in religions, these rituals that involve water and wine and things like that didn't just develop randomly, but they are a kind of empirical science that developed because even though they didn't have objective measurement and p-values and all that, people over the generations did notice that when people focused in therapeutic intentioned awareness on a substance, that it not only changed it in some way, which they couldn't at that time measure, but it also had an effect on how people felt and their aesthetic appreciation of it. So this goes on even down to if you look at how religions operate, you can see that not only are religions, they like special places, and those places, because they become more numinous, so there is a change. I think what's going on, there is a change in the informational architecture non-locally, that non-local information architecture of which that building the Chartres Cathedral, for instance, is in fact a physical manifestation. Now I'm going to run out of time before I can get into all of this, but what I will do very quickly before, because I see my time's run out, is you can see this down to the way letters are formed, or the shape of the letters. You can see why, for instance, thangkas in Buddhism, these kind of spiritual telephone booths, why these things have power, why rosaries have power. You have a blessed rosary, and every time you focus on it, you're making it more numinous for yourself. So as you look at religions and peel back through them down to the fundamentals of what they're doing, forgetting the dogma, what you get is that these are empirical sciences which have been confirmed now by non-local consciousness scientific research, that religion and science in a way have gotten to the same place by very different routes. And so I think when we think about religion and we think about spiritual practices, we need to realize what they are actually doing and why they play the role that they do in our cultures throughout the world, throughout history. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think the word you were trying to come up with was the sanctification ceremony for the wine, where the blessing of the Eucharist, where they're changing the water into wine.
Somebody tell me now. It's I went up to the altar.
Oh, I didn't mean to throw you off there. It's just
the word will come to me, of course, the minute I.
Of course it will. Well, hey,
anyway, I'll do any questions you want to do now.
Okay, I love the way you reach back to bring forward this same communion is what we were talking about.
Communion. Thank you.
Okay, yes. And so, but I love the way you reach back to the past, and you can see the same types of things that we're doing currently. And of course, these guys aren't easy with questions. So when you're talking about each religion having this non-local experience being a foundation, question is, who do you identify in Judaism or in Shinto that might be the single founder?
Well, Judaism, it's more complicated because it isn't clear who actually began Judaism. There are several personalities that play a role, but so I don't have a single person answer. But for instance, you look at Mormonism. Joseph Smith claims he goes to the sacred grove, meditates, and has this spiritual experience. So you see it. I can't think of any enduring religion that doesn't begin in this way. Now, maybe somebody has got one that I haven't thought of, but
well, the other question was Shinto, and I'm not familiar with Shinto's background, but are you? Or do you?
No,
do you have
I'm not sufficiently. Hinduism, I looked into that. You can't get anywhere. And Shintoism, I have not explored that one in the same way.
There was a quote by Patanjali, which said, "The more circumstances are against you, the more manifest becomes your inner power." Can you comment on that?
Say it again.
The more circumstances are against you, the more manifest becomes your inner power.
Well, that is the presumption that if you are practicing meditation, and if you look at, for instance, not just in religion, if you look at people who have scientists, for instance, who are responsible for great creative breakthroughs. Poincaré says he walked across the street, and while he was doing that, he had a vision that explained to him the mathematics for which he became so famous. Descartes says he has 3 dreams in Ulm, Germany in 1619, and out of that becomes his mathematical insights. Einstein says he was whiling away an afternoon in a canoe after being sick when he suddenly had a revelation about relativity. I was talking to Jonas Salk once at a conference, and we were walking across the Salk Institute, and I said, "Where did you get the idea for the vaccine?" And he said, "In a dream." Well, just like Kolka's dream. I had a dream and I went into the lab and said, "Let's do this," and it worked. I mean, there are just endless cases that show that spiritual epiphanies, scientific breakthrough insights, or mundane things like describing a teacup in a closet are all exactly the same experience as the people experience them. The difference is context and intention. So if you are the target of a lot of negative stuff and things are going against you, your ability to stay focused and to sustain an intention-focused awareness gives you the strength and the conviction to continue. And if you look at the histories of spiritual leaders and all of the negative attacks and things that they undergo, you can see that what kept them going was these experiences.
That was a good explanation. I would have never pulled that from that quote, but it's a great way to evaluate it. So I just want to try to get 2 more questions in here if we can. And one is that you were talking about sacred spaces, and Wiccan they do not have their constant sacred space, but they create a space wherever they are meeting. I was wondering if you could relate that to non-locality.
Well, it's the same thing. You know, the Wiccans are, when I think about Wiccans, they remind me most of all of the Etruscans. Very few people know anything about the Etruscans. The Etruscans predate the Romans. In fact, the Etruscans had a school of clairvoyance, which was so impressive that when Rome had conquered the 12 Etruscan cities, they still kept this clairvoyance school going because it was so impressive. So when you look at the Wiccans, and the Etruscans used oak groves. Now, the reason they used oak groves is that oak groves get hit by lightning more than other species of trees in Italy. And there's a whole long discussion of why that happens. But in any case, what the Wiccans are doing is they recognize that where you go, you meet and hold focused intention, you create sacred space. And they have certain things that they look for, at least all the Wiccans I've talked to, mostly women. There are certain things that they look for when they are trying to do a gathering and a time. And I mean, there is a ritual of their choice, but it is about creating sacred space. Now, they don't think of it as you're making it more numinous and, you know, this is objectively measurable. And that's not how they think of it. But when I have talked with Wiccans, that's what they tell me.
Yes, and it does sound very similar to the way that oftentimes mediums clear a space or hold a space for a group that they might be working with. So it sounds very, very similar. So, Stephen, I only have one more question. I appreciate you've been very generous with your time. You know, besides this non-locality that you identify as starting the religions, nearly every religion also deals with what happens after death. Do you see that related to the non-locality, or do you see this as a different discussion altogether that we're not going to be able to get into tonight?
No, I think I thought I said that earlier. When you look at religions, they all have this idea. You know, when I started doing this research about 20 years ago, and by the way, I got started in this because of a paper of Charlie Tart's that I read that was published in, let me think a minute, was published in Science in June of 1972. It was called States of Consciousness and State-Specific Science. Yes, Sciences. I think it's plural. Anyway, Charlie was the one who originally got me started in this, because the point he's making, he wrote a book also called Altered States of Consciousness, but the point was that he got me thinking of it way back in 72. I had been studying I spent 5 years reading all of the Edgar Cayce readings, all 15,000 of them. And then I read everything that had ever been published about parapsychology that any university had. So I read all the journals, and there were things that I thought were strangely missing. The decline effect, of course, is part of it, but they didn't seem to really grasp or grapple with the idea that Charlie brought forward, that these are states of consciousness. And so when you think about that, I ask myself, why would all religions believe in continuity of consciousness? I don't know of a single religion that says when you die, that's it, period, dead meat, no consciousness. I can't think of one. I don't know, maybe somebody knows one. So why is that? I mean, whether you're in Africa or Asia or the Native Americans or somewhere down in South America, whatever, this idea of the continuity of consciousness, I think, arises because, as I said, these are empirical sciences that develop not because of objective measurement, the way we do it in science, but because of observation. I mean, you look at Ayurvedic medicine, for instance, or acupuncture. Those are medical practices which work. How did they develop them? They developed them over generations of one teacher saying to his students, if you do this, this is what will happen. And the student does it, and it does happen. And so he tells his students later on, if you do this, this will happen. And out of that, I think it was because people had non-local consciousness experiences. I mean, if you think about it, look at an evangelical Christian ceremony. What happens? You meet at the appointed time, in the appointed place. Forget about the homilies and the commentary. That's not it. You have a singing, drumming, chanting. Why? Well, Andrew Newberg tells us why, because those things cause brain entraining. All the brains of all the people linked together and all sort of going up and down in the same way. So they are joining together for common intention. And then there is a period when some, but not all, and not always, and unpredictably, individuals in the community have public non-local consciousness experiences, speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing. And then there is a recommitment to gather again at another time. So all of the religions have this same sequence of events in which the ultimate fundamental is the experience of non-local consciousness.
Well, Stephen, it's been great exploring this with you tonight, and I can tell oftentimes we do when we see each other speak about these things for hours. But we have used up your time. I really appreciate you being generous with us tonight.